so I wanted to make sure we give them time to log in. But thank you so much for attending the webinar. We'll spend some time talking about the program as a whole, but mostly we'll focus on the specifics of the application, which is now available in ODMs. And I see from the list of attendees that a lot of you have already worked on the application, so you might it might be a refresher for you. But if you have some specific questions, please ask those in chat. Maybe you have some, higher level concerns that we, or, more in-depth, I guess, the opposite, concerns that we can address. So this is Anna, and in the room with me I have Michelle Rockwell and April Messenger. So we all three will kind of pass, pass the mic to each other to fill you in on the different parts of the application. So,
hello, this is April.
And hi, I'm Michelle at the State Board. As you'll find out later, I read your grant budget.
And I'm April Messenger, and I am the ODMs administrator here at the State Board. What? The grant timeline?
So the grant is now open in ODMs. You can start working on the application, and could you click ahead, please? It is due in ODMs on April 6th by 11:55 p.m. The application does close at that time, so you will not be able to submit it after that time. You will not be able to make any changes. You will be able to make changes once we review the application and provide feedback. If there are some things that need to be edited, we will send it back to you. We are available until 4 p.m. on the 6th to assist with any questions. So, you can always start by emailing or calling me, and then I will be able to triage your question, whether it's ODMs related to April or if it's fiscal to Michelle.
So as Anna mentioned, your applications must be completed in ODMs, and we are going to walk you through some pieces of ODMs. Just 1 second. Share my screen. And here is ODMs. Your college security contacts create ODMs accounts for you. SBCTC cannot create accounts for college users. If you don't know who your security contact is, there's a tab on the main login screen that will show you who to contact at your school. Every organization that's ever applied is listed on this page. This looks a little bit different because we are in the test site, so just keep that in mind as we're showing you some things today. Next to the Security Contacts tab is a How-To tab where you can find a user manual that is very beneficial to read if you're having issues with ODMs. I highly recommend reading through that if you have questions or something might not be working right. It is entirely possible that your college has a process where only certain staff has access to ODMs. If that's the case, those staff will work with you to write and submit your application. Regardless of the process at your college, it's extremely important to work closely with your grant staff. Even if you already have an ODMs user account, you must still contact your college's ODMs security administrator to get access to the 2018 application. Access to last year's application does not carry over to this year's application. Or if you're at a school where your grant staff will submit the applications for you, you'll still need to go to them and let them know about this year's application. On the login screen, you'll see the username and password. If you have forgotten your username or password, you can contact your security admin, or you can type in your username and click the Retrieve My Password button here, and you should get an email automatically. If It emails your password within about 30 seconds. If you haven't received it in 2 minutes, check your spam or junk mail folder. If it's not there either, double check with your security administrator to make sure the email address is entered correctly. A little typo can prevent you from getting an email that's important to your application. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. And here you'll see your grant application, if you've been given access by your security administrator, will appear under this section called Available Grants. You will click on Create New Application, and this is where the application will appear. Only go through this application once. Once you have started an online application, it will populate in this section here under Grant Application. Like I mentioned earlier, you see a lot here because this is our test site. This will not be as populated for your school. If you can't find your application once you've created it and saved it, make sure you are selecting fiscal year 18. Because we are in fiscal year 17 right now, OGMS automatically defaults to FY17. OGMS also has a security feature where the system will time out after 20 minutes of an activity. Keep in mind that it doesn't count typing as activity or clicking checkboxes or radio buttons. There is a pop-up window that will pop up every 15 minutes to remind you that you'll need to save. If you have a pop-up blocker, you might not see that. So make sure that you are saving every 15 minutes. I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody that says, I just spent 2 hours typing and lost everything. So we don't want that to happen to you. Now that you know how to log into OGMS, we will go through the sections of the application. And
can you do like once you get in, can you do like a control and scroll up with your mouse? It's kind of hard to see.
Why is that doing that? Edit. Okay. Do what?
Control and scroll up with your mouse. There you go. There, perfect.
Okay.
Even better. Yep.
So the first section is the applicant info screen. This is where you will enter your contact information. Both contacts listed here will get emails from OGMS, but only the first contact listed will get the official award email from OBIS. Please be sure that the person you enter in this first contact box is who will be the main grant contact all year long, should your grant get funded. It's entirely possible that your college will require you to put someone from the grant office in either the primary or secondary contact field. Please check in with them about this. Also, as I mentioned earlier, please be careful when entering your email address. If you have a typo, you won't get the automated emails. There are emails that tell you if your application has been returned and needs some modifications and other pertinent things. In your application, you'll see a link off to the right. This is the Grant Info tab. This is where you will find documents to help you walk through this application. Your planning guidelines, planning numbers, the fiscal guidelines, and programs of study. Clicking on this grant opens another screen. So to get back to your application, you'll want to click back. This is a separate tab. To get back here, we have the Assurances tab. The Perkins grant does have a standard assurance. You'll want to make sure that you click on that, and it should work for you. You won't get that error message.
It's just our test site that doesn't work.
It's our test site, but it will open the document and download for you to be able to print and sign, and you will need to upload that into your attachment section. Your application will not be considered complete without this assurance document. Section in the content, sections 1 through 6. Anna?
Yeah, so first, I want to give you a little bit of a Perkins overview. A lot of you are probably familiar with what the intent of the program is, but the broad purpose of the Carl Perkins Act of 2006 is to improve the quality of career and technical education in the United States. So the funding is awarded to each state based on a pretty complex formula driven by population data. And then the state, in the case of Washington, it is the Workforce Board, then splits the funding between K-12 and post-secondary systems. Annual allocation to the state of Washington ranges between 20 and 21 million, and then the post-secondary system receives 56% of the funding, and 44% goes to the K-12 system managed through OSPI. The state board then distributes the funding according to what's called a Pell Plus formula. So when you, in your grant info section, when you look at your planning numbers, the fiscal year 18 planning numbers are made up of our last year's allocation, and then we look at unduplicated enrollments in specific categories, which are worker retraining, Pell, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and current and former TANF. So we are not able at this point to predict more accurately what the Department of Education will give us in the following fiscal year. So these are indeed just planning numbers. That number may change based on what we receive from the feds. And we distribute, so 90% of the basic funding is distributed according to the Pell Plus formula, and the remaining 10% goes to colleges in rural counties and those that have 50% or more of their students enrolled in workforce programs. So when making decisions on how to spend that funding, please allow yourself some flexibility that these numbers may change. We've been fortunate in a way in the last few years that there's been the cuts that the feds have made to the program have not been significant, and with rollover funding unspent in the previous year, most of you have seen a net increase, kind of in the fall. Late fall is when you get that number, but it could go the other way, so I just want to caution you. To be eligible for Perkins funding, the college must carry out all the required activities. So there's a list of activities that you can see in the planning guidelines, and whether you carry those out with Perkins, other federal, state, or local money, you are required to conduct these activities. You are not required to spend Perkins on all of those, but you're still required to conduct them. Thus, the questions focused on K-12 transitions, career counseling, faculty recruitment, etc. We ask all those questions to make sure that that you are on campus carrying out these activities, even though you may not be spending any Perkins money on them. So, do not feel when you are trying to figure out your budget that you need to kind of peanut butter this money across all of these activities. You just need to be conducting them, regardless of what funding. So for sections 1 through 6, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on most of them because you are updating your 5-year Perkins plan in these sections. Most of you are not inventing anything new. The 5-year plan is now in its 9th year. As you know, Perkins has been up for reauthorization for quite a while, and we get very mixed messages from on the federal level about whether it's going to happen or not. We were very close in the last congressional sessions. There were some hang-ups in the Senate regarding the involvement of the authority that the Department of Education has over the program. Now the House is moving again in this congressional session, but it is really too early to say whether we're going to see new Perkins and when we will see it. So for now, this under continuing resolution, the program is being funded, thus, the 9th year of a 5-year plan. So you might find that some of your college's goals and strategies have changed, and the sections are organized based on the required uses of Perkins, and your answers help us evaluate whether the college carries out the required activities. While I'm not going to go through each of these sections in detail, I do want to spend some time on Section 1, which deals with programs of study. And the reason I want to spend some time on it is because it's one of the areas that I have to return grants to colleges most frequently because of the misunderstanding of the difference between program of study and dual credit articulation. So the program of study is defined by Perkins as a non-duplicative sequence of courses that align secondary and post-secondary education and leads to an industry-recognized credential or an associate's degree. And programs of study may or may not include dual credit opportunities. So each college has to have at least one program of study on file. So it is important to know the distinction between, the course-to-course articulations or tech prep and programs of study, because they're not one and the same. And frequently, when I receive in your grant documents, there's a spreadsheet that asks to list programs of study. Very frequently, I get a list of course-to-course articulations, but that is not the requirement for Perkins. It is programs of study. So are there secondary and post-secondary programs that transition students from one, to another and culminate in a credential? So that is the question. And if you are unsure about the distinction, please give me a call and we can look at some specific examples and figure out, is it a course articulation or is it a program of study? So for Section 7 is where I want to spend some time. You are asked to address your performance. So data for the last 3 years is available under Perkins documents on the State Board website. And I am really close to finishing a Tableau dashboard to make this information more usable, and you will be able to see some of the background data as opposed to just your progress towards the to achieving the targets. I do understand that these PDFs of Excel spreadsheets are not very user-friendly. So hopefully within the next 2 weeks you will see a more usable Tableau dashboards. So your targets are set through negotiation with the Workforce Board and the Department of Education. So could we go to the PowerPoint and go to the link on our website so we can look at the indicators? So the Department of Education expects that that the performance will be that the colleges and the state will improve their performance, but by at least 1 percentage point each year. It is not always reasonable to expect that, so we try to negotiate based on what the economic environment is, what our what's on that?
On the link?
Yeah.
I don't know if that will work.
What our enrollment patterns are. So the targets for individual colleges then set as a proportion of state performance for 1P1 and 2P1. And that proportion that you are responsible for was calculated during the baseline year, which was 2011. And for targets 3P1, 4P1, 5P1, and 5P2, they are set at the same level as the state. So in program documents, Perkins Plan documents, yep, and the last of the 3 links, yep. So these are the spreadsheets that I'm trying to convert to Tableau. So you are, you know, you might remember I talked at WEC, now it's been 2 years, that we did change the way that we are reporting 3P1 and 4P1, where before you were responsible for a proportion of the state's target, which was, it was really, I don't even want to talk about that process because it wasn't really reflective of our enrollment patterns in the state. So now it is, you know, of the students that you have, how many are you retaining? What percentage of the students you are retaining? So not a number of students, because those numbers go up and down, and retention rates should be calculated based on, you know, the enrollments that you have. And same with placement. So in the last 2 years, we've negotiated with the feds to report it the way we do it now, which is the same target as the state. So the college is responsible for achieving at least 90% of its target, regardless of how that target is set. And if you achieve less than 90% of any target, you must submit a performance improvement plan in Section 7. If you've missed your targets 3 years in a row, you'll be required to direct a minimum of 1.5% of the funding to activities aimed at improving that indicator. So if you've missed 2 indicators, it's 1.5% for each of the missed indicators, 3% total. And information in Section 7 needs to correspond with the information that you will have in your budget narrative. So that is another area where we see some inconsistencies, that the budget is verifying that you are indeed conducting these improvement activities. So I think this is, you know, are there, yeah, I would like to pause for questions on the contents, you know, on sections 1 through 7. Okay. So it doesn't look like any questions have been submitted. So we can move on to section 8, which deals with okay, so Savina's question is about assurance. Okay, so we'll move on to section 8, budget narrative.
April, do you want to talk about checking the boxes first, or do you want to do that after?
Just go ahead. Can I get it back to ODMs?
Okay. I actually want the slides, I think.
You do?
I don't know. You can go ahead and work up. So we're going to move on to the budget now. Section 8 in the application is the budget narrative, and we're going to skip that section for just a second, and we're going to go to the budget tab itself as soon as April can bring it up. One of the most important things regarding your grant budget is to work closely with your college's grants and/or business office on this grant application and the grant budget. Each college is a little different in terms of process, and it's likely that there will be some kind of internal process that you must follow. Your grants and/or business office staff are very likely either part of that process and can guide you through the rest, or they may actually do some of this work for you. It's, like I said, it varies from college to college. If you're not sure who to contact, ask your college's OGMS security contact to point you in the right direction. That person may even, your OGMS security contact may even be the person to help you with the budget. Also, be sure to take a look at the fiscal guidelines document before developing your budget. And as April pointed out earlier, you can find that fiscal guidelines document in your budget, in the grant info link of OGMS. Bring it to the budget screen. And keep in mind that you can do budget revisions during the grant period at any point. So right now, we're asking you to submit your best guess at how you're going to spend your money. But if halfway through the grant period, like maybe next January, you realize you don't actually need to buy as many supplies as you originally budgeted for, and instead you need more money for travel, you can submit a request to the state board to move money around in your budget. So you don't have to stress too much about your budget items right now, since there's flexibility throughout the grant period. I'm going to go through the different activities and categories for funding, and I'll let you know the fiscal requirements for each. But I invite Anna to interject as necessary to let you know any programmatic requirements of each. Both of us review your budget. I review it for to make sure that things are fiscally okay and that things are technically okay, like are they in the right box? Do you have the right narrative that would satisfy an auditor looking at the fiscal component? And Anna reviews it to make sure that it's programmatically okay and
that it aligns with the priorities of the program, and that your sections 1 through 7 and your budget section are talking to each other, so to say.
Yep. So, for example, you know, let's say you had, 50 computers in your budget to build a computer lab for something. Technically, I'm going to look at that and go, okay, well, that's technically allowable. But Anna may look at that same thing and say, no, I was just at their college. They already have a brand new computer lab. They don't need another one. That doesn't fit. So we both look at your budget and we look for slightly different things. So your Perkins budget has several different activities or lines and several categories or rows. Both for accounting and tracking and reporting purposes, it's critical that things be budgeted on the correct budget lines and in the correct budget cells. You're going to budget most of your grant funds on the required and permissible budget line or activities, the very top line in your budget that you can see there. The performance indicators line or activity is only meant for the required funding that you must budget towards increasing Perkins performance indicators. And Anna, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and that is, when I review your budget, if you have to spend, so if you are not required to use the at least 1.5% of your funding, you then are not required to put any money in specifically in performance indicators. But if you are required, then I want to know, are you really conducting new activities that are aimed at improving that indicator? So if your indicator is struggling year after year and you're putting the same activities, the same costs into your performance indicator, or you're just splitting something that you already are doing in your required and permissible activities and just moving it into performance indicators to satisfy the requirement, I am going to note that and likely, send the application back to you either for clarification or for revision. So the performance indicators line needs to be very intentional, because as a state, if we, the danger is that, if many colleges miss their performance indicators, then we miss our performance indicators as a state. And then the sanctions from the Department of Education, then the DOE steps in and they kind of work with us to tell us how to spend money as a state. And we want to make sure that that the colleges and that our system has autonomy in in making these decisions. So it's very important that we all kind of that we raise all boats by trying to meet these indicators.
Thank you. So then the last line in your budget, the administration line, is where you can budget up to 5% of your grant total for administrative expenses related to the Perkins program. These are things like staff time for oversight of programs, grant administrative requirements like grant writing, reporting, and billing, monitoring budgets or reports, and supervision of CTE staff or faculty, and any associated expenses like any office supplies that they may need to do those parts of their jobs, that type of thing. So you can either enter grant budget numbers on this screen, the budget screen, or the budget narrative screen, which is section 8 of the content. Everywhere that you budget funds, you have to have a corresponding budget narrative in section 8. So April, can you go ahead and enter in like $1,000 right there? And yeah, perfect. And then do the save. Yeah, it's going to give us errors because we're not ready for that. But let's go, yep, content section 8. So any dollar amounts that you populate on either screen, whether the budget matrix screen or this budget narrative screen, they're going to auto-populate on the other screen. So you have flexibility to do whatever works for you. And regardless of where you enter the budget numbers, though, you have to enter the narrative descriptions on this screen. And you have to have a budget narrative description for each corresponding budget cell. If you're not budgeting funds in a certain area, so let's say, for example, in 8B, goods and services, maybe you don't need any money for goods and services, which I know is not realistic, but you weren't budgeting any money there. You leave it as a 0, and then in that description box, leave that box blank. Don't put not applicable or NA or anything like that, because you're going to get an error, because OGMS is set to require a narrative answer if and only if you have a dollar amount budgeted. So we're going to walk through each of the budget categories now, and we'll switch back to the PowerPoint for that. And I will say that your budget categories, yep, next slide. Oh, no, you're right. Back one more. I will say that the fiscal guidelines, which you can find in the grant info section of OGMS, the fiscal guidelines have all of this information in it. It's got really good stuff, so do give those a look through. Salaries and budgets is where you'll budget costs for employees at your college. These are only for direct employees, so not any contractors that you may use or any faculty or staff at other colleges, but you would include your own college's employees. So sometimes you might have a special contract stipend type of thing for somebody to develop curriculum or review curriculum. If they're still a direct employee of your college, you're going to budget them there, even though you may call that special pay a contract. Unless they're truly a contractor, you budget them here under salaries. You have to include staff titles, a brief description of their duties as they relate to this grant, and some kind of salary breakdown. You can give us an FTE amount, the percentage of their salary funded by the grant, or an hourly wage. Page 3 of the fiscal guidelines document has examples of how to format those narrative answers for salaries. We need that level of detail in your answers. In order for us to approve your budget, we have to be able to show that all of your costs are both necessary and reasonable, which is why we need the FTE or the hourly wage info or the percent of effort. We need to be able to, because you know, by the position description you're putting in, we're going to be able to determine that they're, you know, most likely that they're necessary, that those costs are necessary. Like you need that person or those positions to be able to run your program. But your salary info helps us determine that the costs are reasonable. If we can see that they're making, you know, $200 an hour, that's probably not reasonable. But if we see that they're making, you know, $20 to $50 an hour, depending on what their position is, then we can determine that that's reasonable for their position. So that's, I mean, we're not just asking for this just to be picky. It is a federal requirement of us as the pass-through entity that we make sure all of your costs are necessary and reasonable before we approve them. So goods and services is where you'll budget items that you'll use in your Perkins program. It's okay to be a little generic here. You can say you'll purchase office supplies. You don't need to tell us every item that you're going to buy, like pens and paper clips and envelopes. But while it's okay to say that you'll purchase office supplies, it's not okay just to say that you'll purchase goods and services. And you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes over goods and services and office supplies. The term goods and services is too broad. We need more specifics than that. Office supplies is okay. Classroom supplies, maybe you're purchasing classroom supplies for a specific project that relates to Perkins, Anna gave me a little side look, so that may, you know, it would have to be allowable for program purposes. Yeah, food is a great thing. We'll talk about food here too. Food would go under goods and services probably. It may go under travel depending on where you're buying the food. And that's where you need to work with your fiscal department and your grants office, because they're going to help you determine, you know, is food at your college or is food on the go? Is it travel? Is it goods and services? The feds are really starting to crack down on food. And we're seeing it not just in Perkins, we're seeing it in every federal program that we have. Other states are seeing it too. It's become the new kind of normal thing. Food is technically allowable, but the feds are really putting a huge burden of proof on the grantee to prove that food is an absolute necessity. So light refreshments and continental breakfasts are never allowable with federal funds such as Perkins, but working meals, you can purchase food for working meals if you can prove that it was a working meal and that you had to have that meeting over the meal time. The feds really want you to break long enough to send your people off-site to go buy their own food. So you have to have a really solid justification that you couldn't possibly have let them go somewhere else. You couldn't have, start the meeting earlier and run it later to give them an hour and a half to go off-site to get their meals. That type of thing. Anna, did you want to add?
Yes, so in Perkins, the way that that we get requests for food expenses most commonly is either they're working lunches during a day-long meeting. So then we would want you to think about what are the implications of sending these people off to eat? Is it breaking up your agenda in a way that is disruptive? Does the meeting then have to go beyond the normal working day? So just have some documentation, to verify that it was necessary. Another expense that is common is dinners for advisory committees. Mm-hmm. So again, you would have to make a case for why that meeting couldn't take place during the day. Why did it have to take place during the dinner time? Why couldn't it start later? And were there options available to purchase meals? So it may be allowable if you are able to explain all of these requirements. So these are the two most common expenses that we see for food.
And if you have a solid justification for it and it would be allowable, it has to be a working meal, and your agenda will have to prove that it was a working meal. We recently saw an agenda that had lunch on it or breakfast on it or maybe both, but it didn't say it was a working meal. It didn't identify what work was going to happen. So your agenda should really say, working meal, discussion on blah, blah, blah. So that it is really solid, in addition to your justification on why it had to happen that time and why you couldn't break for the meal. So yeah, and like I said, that's something that's bigger than just Perkins. We're seeing it pretty much in all of our federal programs. So back to goods and services. Please be aware that any non-consumable items must be retained by your college for use in the Perkins program. I don't know that that's necessarily a problem with your main Perkins grant, but sometimes we see it in your Perkins leadership grants, like your non-trad or your best practices. Sometimes you're buying supplies for a student event, and sometimes the supplies are consumable. You're buying, paper that they're going to use at the event, or welding supplies that are going to be consumed at the event. But any non-consumables like goggles or protective gear or any of those types of things, your college does have to retain to use them for your Perkins program. You're also going to budget services here, and services most likely are going to be things like interagency agreements or interlocal agreements, which are defined as contracts between two or more public entities. So if you have an interagency agreement or an interlocal agreement between your college and another college, that gets budgeted here under goods and services. Any other services you might have would be there as well, but I'm not thinking offhand any services that come to mind that are typically budgeted in your grant. Building rental is the next category. Building rental and utilization is if you have to rent space to accomplish grant objectives. This might be rent at a community building where you offer Perkins services. Any rent charged to this grant has to be at or below what is considered to be fair market value in your area. In your budget narrative, write in that you've verified that the rent is at or below fair market value, or FMV is the abbreviation for that. Also keep documentation that backs up that statement. So you keep your documentation that shows that you did your research, that this is at or below fair market value. Also, the only way you can charge rent of a college or a college-owned or a college foundation-owned facility to this grant is if your college or your foundation has a policy that rent is charged to every program, not just your Perkins program. If that's the case, be sure to include that in your narrative as well, that it is your college's policy to charge rent to all programs. And be sure to keep that documentation in your file as well, so keep a copy of that policy. Travel is the next budget category, and it's fairly self-explanatory. Just tell us generally why the travel is required. Is it for meetings with other colleges, for shared projects? Is it travel to professional development activities or for something else? And the only reminder I have for you is that all state travel rules must be followed and state travel rates must be used. So even though these are federal funds, the state has typically more restrictive travel rules, and your college is a state entity. So make sure you're following all the state rules, state rates, and then your college will probably also have some internal processes that you have to follow. So make sure you're doing all that as well. Contracts is the next budget category, and this is where you'll budget any true contracts your organization has. Most often in Perkins, we see things like guest speakers for professional development or curriculum review or development budgeted here. And again, those are only if they're external to your college that you're contracting with. Give us a brief description of what the contract is for. And then don't forget that any rules that apply to your college under this grant must also be passed along to the contractor. For example, you're required to follow state travel rules and rates for travel. So if you contract with someone and you're going to reimburse their travel, you have to make sure that they follow all state rules and rates for that travel as well. You know, we can't often buy food for meetings. So if your contractor is going to host a meeting, you can't necessarily reimburse them to buy food for the meeting. Those types of things. Capital outlays is the next category. The most important thing to remember with capital outlays is that they must be approved by the state board prior to your organization making the purchase. If they're not already in your budget, do a budget revision in OBIS to add them before you make that purchase. Capital outlays are defined as property or equipment with a useful life in excess of 1 year and a per unit acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. So these are going to be things typically like a welder or a lift for your auto program or a sim mannequin for your healthcare programs. These are big, expensive things. There's not a group of, 10 computers or 20 computers that add up to more than whatever, because the computers are individual items. These are things that are per unit with an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. Acquisition cost probably includes shipping and tax. It will depend on your college's policy for that. So work closely with your college's business office and fiscal office on that. In your budget, we need you to be pretty specific about the capital outlays that will be purchased. You can't put a placeholder in your budget that simply says equipment. We have to be able to know and approve those specific items that you'll purchase and before you purchase them. Capital outlays also must typically be considered special purpose items, and I'm doing air quotes over special purpose items. Oh, it's on there as well. Great. To be eligible for this grant. General purpose items like furniture with a per unit price of $5,000 or more probably will not be approved. They really do have to be special purpose items. Things like we discussed earlier, like a welder or a sim mannequin, something very specially with a very special purpose. Tuition, books, and fees and student fees is where you're going to budget any tuition, books for students, and required fees. A couple of notes on that. This is only for special population students or non-traditional employment and training students. Your college has to have a broader effort to address the needs of these special population CTE students in order to be able to budget funds here. In order to be able to charge student fees to this grant, the fees have to be required fees. They would have to be required for any student in the program that they're taking, not just because they're a Perkins student or a special pop student or a non-trad student. And tuition, books, and fees can be paid from this grant, but funds can never be given directly to a student to buy their own books or pay their own tuition or fees. College must pay these directly. Anna, do you want to talk any more about the broader special POPs effort?
I don't have much to add here, except for also be very very aware of any supplanting, you know, that occurs. So especially, you know, because you support quite a few of your students through worker retraining funds, you may be required to give those funds back and look for, you know, ways to support those students if they're members for special populations and worker retraining funds are gone. You may be able to use Perkins money for that. If you then, you know, get your worker retraining money back the same fiscal year, you are not able to then use your Perkins money for that purpose, because now, you know, because this is an actual scenario that that has happened a couple of weeks ago, that, you know, that some of that money came back. Well, you have to move your those students off of Perkins, because that would be supplanting. So just be careful of any of those issues.
Yep, great. And if you need to refund money to your grant in the same grant year, so let's say we're in the middle of FY18 next year, and you did, and that just happened, like say you charged, you know, you paid for some of their tuition with Perkins funds, and then you got other funds back, and so you needed to refund the money to the Perkins program. If it's in the same grant year, in your next invoice, just put a negative dollar amount in tuition for the amount that you need to actually return to the grant. As long as your overall invoice is a positive amount, it's okay to have a negative in one of those areas. If your overall invoice is a negative total, wait and invoice the next time so that you have a positive, so that we can still send you a check and you're not having to send us a check back. If that happens after the grant year, so let's say you just realized that happened for FY16 and FY16 is over because now we're in FY17, you would actually need to send us a check back for that, in which case you'd want to send me an email or call me for directions on how to do that. We have pretty specific, like, what does the check have to say, what needs to be with it, where does it need to go. So just send me an email or call me and I'll give you directions on how to do that. Indirect is the last budget category. Your organization can claim up to 5% of salaries, but not benefits, charged to the grant in indirect. This is to cover such costs as operation, maintenance, library, and student administrative expenses, things that cannot be clearly allocated to any one individual program. Does anybody have any questions about where to budget funds before we move on? Great. So let's move on to section 9 in the actual application again. Sorry. It sort of feels like aerobic, like virtual aerobics going back and forth. So content section 9 is new this year, and it relates to grant and fiscal accountability. Because this grant is funded with federal funds now require us to assess a grantee's level of risk before we grant those funds. Your answers to these questions in section 9 help us to determine your risk, but we're also going to add in other things that we know about, things like past state board audit reports, any program monitoring that Anna has done. We're going to look at all of those things and your answers to these questions to help us determine risk. We tried to make the questions here as simple as possible while still meeting our federal requirements. So the first question asks you about cash flow. Hopefully as a state entity, that's not an issue, but if it is, we do need an accurate answer. The next 4 questions ask about the number of federal grants your organization has and how many years of experience your organization and staff have with federal grants. I just had a question, not in this webinar, but an emailed question about 9.2, how many federal grants does your organization currently have? Include the federal grants that you get from the state board, as well as any grants that you might get directly from the feds, or any grants that might be passed through to you from another entity. Maybe one college gets a direct federal grant, and maybe your college gets a sub-grant from that other college. Include those as well. So we're just looking at how many federal grants in total do you have. Question 9.6 asks if your organization has received any audit findings from any independent audit in the last 3 years. For the purposes of this question, an independent audit means that the audit was conducted by a party other than your own college or the state board. And please, we've had questions about this one as well. Include any findings that you have received and briefly explain them in 1.6a. If it's something we determine that doesn't really relate to how your organization manages grants, then we'll disregard it when assessing risk. So for example, maybe it's an audit, somebody had asked about, they had an audit finding relating to, I think it was something to do with campus security, but it really didn't impact fiscal or grants. We don't have a way to say include this but not this, because we don't know what all findings could be possible. So in that case, our answer to them was yes, include that as an audit finding, but in the 9.6a, tell us what it relates to, and when we see that it has to do with, campus security and it's not fiscal in the least bit, we'll disregard that. And 9.7 asks how your organization will monitor funds from this grant to make sure you're meeting the conditions of the grant and adhering to all deadlines such as billing and budget revisions. Organizations are required to have processes and procedures, so briefly tell us what those processes are. We left the character count fairly small for these answers because we don't need you to include every tiny detail of your process. Just give us an overview. Tell us, do you have a desk manual that new staff get and review? Is it something different? What's your process? And then if we have questions with what you told us, we'll come back and ask you for more information if we need more info. 9.8 asks about your procedures to ensure that all grant terms and conditions are met. Again, do you have desk manuals? Do you have something else? Tell us what your organization does. 9.9 asks about how new staff are trained on grant requirements. And 9.10 asks how all of your staff are trained when grant requirements or procedures change. And finally, 9.11 asks how your organization ensures that time and effort guidelines are applied. Again, do you have manuals for that? What do you do? What's your process? How do you make sure that any variances are reported and reconciled and billings are updated if they need to be? Any questions on the fiscal accountability questions before we move on to the next section? And while you are typing, I think April might tell you more about the grant application itself.
Yeah, we just want to make sure that you remember to complete every part of the grant application. When you go to the Submit tab, you can't submit unless every checkbox up here is complete. Once these boxes are checked, that shows that all sections are complete, and these boxes here will open up for you to type in your name and the date. Once you submit, your application will change on this home screen from in process to submitted. And then once it is approved or we require feedback, these changes will appear on your home screen of OGMS. You can see here's an approved, this is submitted, here's one in progress. Make sure when you're in the application filling out these different tabs, this box right here is what you need to complete to make sure that each page is saved. And that's what will prompt your tabs up here you check. Once your page is complete, these checkboxes automatically appear. If there's feedback needed, you'll receive a notification that feedback is requested, and you'll see that on the feedback screen, where you'll see what the date was entered and what the feedback is. To respond to feedback, your particular question or spot on the application that we are requesting more information on will be listed here. So if there's a question on 2.2a, it will say 2.2a with an explanation of what we need more information on.
And I just wanted to say that Michelle and I, in April, we try to coordinate our feedback so you don't get multiple requests for feedback. But once we, do the original review of your application, and then, you may be required to follow up again and again, depending on who is submitting that feedback. So if there is feedback, you will hear, in kind of a unified fashion, in this comment section, it would say, is this fiscal or is this program feedback? And then you will continue working with the person who provided that feedback to make sure that, that you have addressed it.
So let me say that a different way. I mean, that made sense to me. So typically, Anna will send all of our feedback together, both hers and my feedback to you the first time. And then you'll respond to respond to all of the changes at once. Resubmit your application, and then often it's something like I've said, okay, you told us these positions you're going to fund, but you didn't tell us their duties, so can you please add the duties for these positions? And then Anna's asked you to do something else, and you've done that, and then oftentimes hers will be fine, and she'll say, okay, it's good. And then maybe on mine, like you've added the duties, but maybe now the duties sound like they might be administrative instead of direct services. So then I'm going to come back to you with more clarification. But instead of sending that feedback through Anna to you, I'm going to send that to you directly. So as long as she's not sending you any more feedback about, then you can assume that your part that you did for her is fine, if that makes sense.
And once you submit your feedback, you want to make sure to resubmit your application so that it will notify us that those changes have been made. That's it for ODMs. And is there any other questions? No questions?
And if not, then we end half an hour early and we get like a bonus time.
And of course, you know exactly where to find us. The contact information is up on the screen, and if I'm not available, Kathy Gable, who is not didn't join us today, but she is also available to answer program questions. So between the two of us, we'll hopefully we'll have an answer.
I do see one question or a statement from Trish. You received an error message on the assurances earlier this week. That has been updated and they have been changed. So if you were having an issue with that part of the application earlier this week, you should be fine now.
Okay, well, if there are no questions, then we will wrap up a little bit early, and thank you so much for joining us. Do keep in touch. I'm sure that I will be in touch with many of you. I hope to have feedback to you by the end of May. It is, with all the grants, it is a very busy time. I try not to dilly-dally, but we will have all the grants substantively approved before the end of June. So we have to have everything, all our ducks in a row before the July 1st fiscal year start. So between, kind of late May, early June is when you may be working with me or Michelle on on refining your application. But hopefully, you know, end of May, early June is our goal. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your morning.